This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome. Today, we explore a story written in stone, blood, and language. The complex legacy of Muslim history in Spain. Was it a foreign occupation or a local transformation? We'll journey from the legendary Reconquista to the vibrant, contested paradise of Al-Andalus. Along the way, we'll uncover the hidden pulse of Arabic influence in modern Spanish life and examine the political battles still raging over this shared past. Get ready for a deep dive into the myths and realities that define the Spanish identity today. The story of modern Spain often begins with a single powerful word, Reconquista. For generations of Spanish schoolchildren, this term has defined nearly 800 years of history as a singular, heroic struggle to win back a stolen land. The narrative is straightforward and compelling. It tells of a Christian nation that was tragically overwhelmed by a foreign Islamic invasion in the year 711, followed by a centuries-long crusade to liberate the peninsula, culminating in the final victory of the Catholic monarchs at Granada in 1492. However, when we look beneath the surface of this nationalist epic, we find a reality that is far more complex, fluid, and deeply rooted in local soil than the myth of a foreign occupation suggests. The very term Reconquista was not even used by the people living through those centuries. It is a 19th century invention, coined at a time when Spain was searching for a unifying national identity after the painful loss of its global empire. The philosopher José Ortega y Gasset famously captured the intellectual absurdity of this framing when he remarked, "I don't understand how a thing that lasted 8 centuries can be called a reconquest." By framing those 800 years as a mere interruption of a pure Christian destiny, this narrative transformed what was essentially a period of local transformation and internal conflict into a story of us versus them, of native versus invader. To understand how this myth was constructed, we have to go back to the beginning, to the year 711. The traditional story depicts a massive, unstoppable wave of Arab invaders sweeping across the Strait of Gibraltar to crush a native Christian kingdom. But the historical record suggests something much messier. At the time, the Iberian Peninsula was ruled by the Visigoths, a Germanic tribe that had migrated into the region centuries earlier. Far from being native Iberians, the Visigoths were a ruling minority that made up perhaps only 1 or 2% of the total population. Furthermore, the Nicene Christianity they championed was not an indigenous development, but a faith that had been imposed on the peninsula by the Roman Empire under Theodosius. This ruling class was fractured by internal power struggles and a series of bitter civil wars. When a force of roughly 7,000 men, mostly North African Berbers rather than Arabs, crossed the straits under the commander Tariq ibn Ziyad, they didn't arrive as an alien army intent on total destruction. In many ways, they were invited participants in a local conflict. One faction of the Visigothic nobility, known as the Witizens, had been dispossessed of their rights and appealed to Musa ibn Nusar, the governor of North Africa, for military assistance against the king they considered a usurper, Roderick. The rapid collapse of the Visigothic kingdom was not the result of a military miracle, but of a society that was already falling apart. The vast majority of the population, the Hispano-Romans who worked the land, had little loyalty to their Germanic masters. To many, the arrival of the newcomers was seen as a change in management rather than a catastrophic invasion. The terms of surrender offered by the Muslim commanders were often remarkably lenient. Local lords were frequently allowed to keep their lands and their status as long as they paid tribute. The famous Treaty of Theodomir, signed in 713, shows a local Visigothic ruler being granted autonomy and religious freedom for his people in exchange for loyalty to the new administration. This was not a total replacement of one people by another. It was a political realignment in a world where borders were porous and loyalties were often based on local survival rather than religious ideology. As the Muslim forces moved further north, they encountered the Frankish realms, leading to the Battle of Tours, also known as the Battle of Poitiers, in 732. This event provides a prime example of how nationalist myth-making operates. In Western historiography, this battle is often presented as the salvation of Europe, the moment when Charles Martel halted the Islamic tide and preserved Christian civilization. However, Muslim chroniclers of the time recorded the event as a minor skirmish, a border raid that went awry, rather than a failed attempt at continental conquest. This discrepancy highlights how a relatively small military encounter can be retroactively transformed into a cosmic struggle for the soul of a continent to serve a specific cultural narrative. One of the most persistent elements of the Reconquista myth is the idea that the Moors were a distinct foreign race that occupied Spain. But the term Moor itself is an exonym, a label applied by outsiders that has no real ethnic or biological precision. Over the centuries, the vast majority of the people who made up the society of Al-Andalus were not immigrants from the Middle East or North Africa. They were the descendants of the same Hispano-Romans and Visigoths who had lived there for thousands of years. As the centuries passed, these local people converted to Islam in massive numbers, driven by social, economic, and spiritual factors. By the 10th century, it is estimated that the majority of the inhabitants of the peninsula were Muslim, yet they were ethnically identical to their Christian neighbors in the north. They spoke Arabic, practiced Islam, and built a sophisticated urban civilization, but they were as Spanish as any of the kings who would eventually conquer them. The Reconquista narrative effectively othered these people, turning millions of native Iberians into foreign invaders simply because of the religion they practiced and the language they spoke. This process of rewriting the past reached its peak in the 19th century. As Spain faced a deep national malaise following the loss of its American colonies, historians and cultural architects sought to restore the country's confidence by forging a unifying myth. They looked back to the medieval period and reimagined it as a glorious crusade for national redemption. They took the figure of Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, better known as El Cid, and transformed him from a complex historical figure into the ultimate symbol of a unified, pure Christian Spain. In the popular imagination, El Cid became the Moor Slayer, a knight of unswerving loyalty to king and faith. This version of the hero was later embraced and promoted by the dictatorship of Francisco Franco, who used the imagery of the Reconquista to justify his own vision of a traditionalist Catholic nation. However, the historical El Cid was a far cry from the nationalist icon he became. Born in the mid-11th century, he lived in a world known as the Taifa period, a time when the unified caliphate of Córdoba had collapsed into dozens of small, competing principalities. This was a fractured, multi-confessional world where political survival mattered far more than religious purity. El Cid was, at his core, a practical man and a brilliant mercenary. He spent 5 years serving the Muslim rulers of Zaragoza, fighting against both Christian and Muslim rivals. He led a mixed band of warriors that included both Christians and Muslims, and he eventually carved out his own independent principality in Valencia. Even his name betrays the multicultural world he inhabited. El Cid is derived from the Arabic word al-Sidi, meaning the master. To the people of his own time, he was a man who moved with ease across religious boundaries. Yet the nationalist narrative had to strip away these complexities to turn him into a saint of the Reconquest. The Battle of Covadonga, which took place around 720 in the rugged mountains of Asturias, is another pillar of this construction. It is often cited as the symbolic beginning of the Reconquista, the moment the real Spain began to fight back. In reality, it was a minor skirmish where a small group of Christian rebels defeated a Muslim patrol. Yet in the nationalist narrative, it was transformed into a foundational miracle. This idea of a pure northern resistance that was never tainted by Moorish influence remains a point of pride for some, fueling a sense of identity based on the exclusion of the Islamic past. This binary view of history is reinforced every year in towns across Spain through the popular Moros y Cristianos festivals. These celebrations feature elaborate costumes, mock battles, and the eventual triumph of the Christian forces. While they are often seen as harmless traditions, they solidify the myth that the history of the peninsula was a constant war between two fixed opposing camps. They ignore the reality that for much of those 800 years there was more peace than war, and that alliances often crossed religious lines. The Reconquista narrative also serves to downplay the immense cultural and intellectual contributions of the Islamic period by framing them as something that happened to Spain rather than being an integral part of its development. When people speak of the Great Mosque of Córdoba or the Alhambra in Granada, there is often a tendency to attribute these marvels to the Arabs, as if they were built by a foreign people who eventually left. This othering of the past allows the monuments to be viewed as artifacts of an occupation rather than the work of local craftsmen and architects who were part of an uninterrupted cultural continuum. The danger of this nationalist myth is that it creates a fragile sense of identity that feels threatened by the truth. When modern historians attempt to deconstruct the legend of El Cid or suggest that the invasion of 711 was actually a complex social revolution, they often face a fierce backlash. For those who have built their sense of belonging on the idea of a pure Christian Reconquista, the reality of a pluralistic and fluid medieval past feels like a sledgehammer taken to the foundation of the country. By transforming a period of intense cultural exchange and internal evolution into a story of foreign occupation and liberation, the myth of the Reconquista has left a deep psychological scar on the Spanish identity. To move forward, there is a growing movement that suggests Spain needs to reclaim its history as a shared rather than a divided legacy. This means recognizing that the people of Al-Andalus were not just an interruption in the story of Spain. They were the ancestors of modern Spaniards, and their world was the crucible in which the modern West was born. This complex reality of coexistence and conflict, known as convivencia, offers a far more accurate and human picture of the past than any nationalist epic ever could. If the Reconquista was not a simple war of liberation, then what was the nature of the society that actually existed during those 8 centuries? Chapter 2. The Contested Paradise. Debating the Reality of Al-Andalus. To walk through the modern streets of Córdoba or Granada is to be confronted by a word that carries an almost mystical weight in the Spanish language, convivencia. Literally translated as living together, this term has become the center of a fierce and ongoing debate about the true nature of the 8 centuries of Muslim rule in the Iberian Peninsula. The term was coined by the historian Americo Castro, who argued that the very essence of Spanishness was forged through the interaction of Christians, Muslims, and Jews. For Castro and his intellectual heirs, Al-Andalus was a lost paradise, a beacon of enlightened tolerance and multicultural harmony. This vision was famously championed by Maria Rosa Menocol, who described the era as an ornament of the world, where faith and reason coexisted. However, this idealized version has faced a sharp counter-narrative. Historians like Claudio Sanchez Albornoz viewed the Islamic period as a disaster that derailed Spain's natural European trajectory, while modern critics like Dario Fernandez Morera argue that the paradise is a dangerous romantic myth hiding a reality of religious cleansing and systemic oppression. The case for the Andalusian paradise often begins with the sheer scale of its cultural and intellectual achievements. While later chapters will explore the specific cultural innovations and infrastructure that defined this era, it is enough here to note that 10th century Córdoba was a marvel of urban sophistication. It was a city of 500,000 people that functioned as the intellectual engine of the West, boasting a library of hundreds of thousands of manuscripts at a time when the largest libraries in Christian Europe might contain only a few dozen volumes. This was a world where science, wisdom, and faith were not yet seen as mutually exclusive, and where the East was not yet separated from the West. In this idealized version of history, the success of Al-Andalus was built on a foundation of religious tolerance that was virtually unheard of elsewhere in the medieval world. The Islamic rulers recognized that they were governing a land with deep Christian and Jewish roots, and they established a legal framework that allowed these communities to survive. Under the status of dhimmi, or protected people, Jews and Christians were granted the right to practice their faith and maintain their own legal systems. This was not merely a passive tolerance, it was often an active partnership. The Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Rahman III, for instance, worked directly with the Mozarabs, the Arabized Christians of the south, placing them in positions of immense administrative power and using their expertise to stabilize the state. He preferred to co-opt his religious rivals rather than annihilate them, creating a bureaucracy where merit could occasionally trump confession. The Jewish community, in particular, experienced what many historians call a Hebrew Golden Age during this period. Inspired by the intellectual fervor of their Arab neighbors, Jewish thinkers in Al-Andalus revolutionized philosophy and poetry. They served as high-ranking diplomats, public administrators, and royal physicians. This was a time when it was possible to be a pious Jew who could also recite pre-Islamic Arabic odes and take the Aristotelian tradition seriously. The Christian population, too, was deeply influenced by this environment. These Mozarabs occupied a unique social space. While they remained firm in their Christian faith and legal standing, they were culturally indistinguishable from the Muslim elite in their public lives, creating a hybrid social class that bridged the divide between the cross and the crescent. However, when we look closer at the legal and social reality of the dhimmi status, the image of Al-Andalus as a modern-style pluralistic democracy begins to fracture. The historian Bernard Lewis provided a crucial distinction for understanding this era, noting that the Muslim attitude toward non-Muslims was typically one of contempt rather than hate. As Lewis argued, second-class citizenship is still a kind of citizenship, and in the medieval context, it was often better than no rights at all. Yet this status was founded on a clearly defined social hierarchy. Non-Muslims were required to pay a special poll tax known as the jizya, which served as a constant reminder of their subordinate status. They were often forbidden from building new churches or synagogues, and in many periods they were barred from carrying weapons or riding horses. The legal system was also heavily weighted against non-Muslims. A dhimmi could not give evidence in an Islamic court, and the compensation for an injury to a Christian or a Jew was lower than that for a Muslim. In the social sphere, the restrictions could be even more personal. A 12th century legal text from Seville reflects the deep-seated contempt Lewis described, stating that a Muslim must not perform menial tasks for a Jew or a Christian, such as cleaning their latrines, because such trades were considered fitting only for those who were vile. This was a society founded on the notion of the primacy of Islam, where currents of ethnic and religious tension ran just beneath the surface of daily life. These tensions occasionally erupted into spectacular violence that shatters the myth of an uninterrupted peace. In the early 9th century, uprisings in Córdoba were met with mass executions and the total destruction of entire neighborhoods. Perhaps the most striking example of the internal conflict within Al-Andalus is the movement of the Martyrs of Córdoba in the mid-9th century. This was a group of 48 Christians who deliberately broke the law by publicly denouncing the Prophet Muhammad, knowing that the penalty was death. These individuals were not being hunted down by the state. They were seeking out martyrdom as a form of protest against the growing Arabization of their own community. They feared that by adopting the language and customs of the Muslims, the Christians of Al-Andalus were losing their identity. The fact that the Christian ecclesiastical authorities themselves eventually disavowed the martyrs shows how deeply divided the society had become. The degree of tolerance in Al-Andalus was also highly dependent on the political climate. While the height of the Umayyad Caliphate allowed for a more relaxed atmosphere, the fragmentation into the petty Taifa kingdoms in the 11th century saw the status of non-Muslims deteriorate as military pressure from the Christian north increased. The most dramatic shift occurred with the arrival of two fundamentalist Berber dynasties from North Africa, the Almoravids and the Almohads. These movements were born out of a desire to return to a rigid orthodoxy. When they crossed into Spain, they were appalled by what they saw as the cultural decadence of Al-Andalus. They were shocked by the luxury of the palaces and the easy interaction between Muslims and infidels. Under their rule, the earlier spirit of convivencia was largely extinguished. The Almohads, in particular, adopted a policy of forced conversion, demanding that Christians and Jews either embrace Islam or leave the peninsula. This led to a mass exodus of non-Muslims toward the Christian kingdoms in the north, forever changing the demographic map of Spain. Even within the Muslim community itself, Al-Andalus was a place of deep divisions. While Chapter 1 noted that Moor is a vague exonym and that the masses were becoming a blended Andalusi population, the ruling elite maintained rigid ethnic categories. At the top were a tiny minority of Arab families who traced their ancestry to the heartland of Islam. Below them were the Berbers from North Africa, who formed the bulk of the military but were often treated as social inferiors. Then there were the Muwaladun, the local Iberian converts who made up the majority of the Muslim population but were frequently excluded from power. These ethnic fractures led to a generation-long civil war in the early 11th century that ultimately brought down the caliphate. The history of Islamic Spain was as much a story of Muslims fighting Muslims as it was a conflict between different faiths. The masculine culture of the Andalusian elite during its heyday has been described by historian Brian Catlos in surprisingly contemporary terms. Catlos characterizes the courtly world as a 9th-century gangsta culture, a testosterone-driven, wine-fueled environment of conspicuous consumption and freestyle wordplay. In this world, court poets functioned like modern journalists or hype men, accompanying military expeditions and celebrating the bling and exploits of their patrons in verse. This was a society that valued swagger and intellectual dominance, yet it remained deeply self-conscious about its position on the western fringe of the Islamic world. This drive to prove they were not provincial led the Andalusian rulers to sponsor the arts and sciences with an intensity that eventually surpassed their eastern rivals in Baghdad. But it also fueled an internal competitiveness that made long-term unity impossible. The debate over the reality of tolerance in Al-Andalus is complicated by the fact that both the romantic and the critical views contain significant truths. If we compare Al-Andalus to a modern 21st century democracy, it fails the test of tolerance completely. But if we compare it to the contemporary Christian kingdoms of the early Middle Ages, the picture looks very different. In most of Europe at the time, religious minorities had no legal standing whatsoever and were often subject to sudden expulsion or mass murder. In that context, the recognized status of the dhimmi, however inferior, provided a level of security and opportunity that was unique in its time. The tragedy of Al-Andalus was not that it failed to be a perfect paradise, but that the complex and fragile social balance it did achieve was eventually destroyed by the forces of religious extremism on both sides. The reality of Al-Andalus was neither a perfect utopia nor a simple dark age of oppression. It was a world of immense creativity and profound cruelty, of brilliant polymaths and fanatical preachers, of peaceful coexistence and sudden brutal violence. It was a society that was constantly reinventing itself, moving between periods of openness and isolation as it navigated the pressures of war and internal rebellion. By moving beyond the binary choice between a paradise and a prison, we can begin to see Al-Andalus for what it truly was, a complex human experiment in living together that shaped the course of Western history. If the political and religious structures of this world were often defined by hierarchy and conflict, what were the tangible, everyday legacies that this contested paradise left behind in the very DNA and language of the people who eventually reclaimed the land? Chapter 3: Hidden Blood, the Arabic Pulse of Spain. To understand the modern Spanish identity, one must look closely at the faces in the streets of Seville, Madrid, or Almeria. There is a frequent and striking contradiction between how many Spaniards see themselves and what their physical features suggest. A traveler once recalled meeting a Spanish colleague in Damascus who spoke with immense pride about her ancestry. She had been named after the Battle of Covadonga, the symbolic beginning of the Christian campaign to retake the peninsula. She beamed as she explained that her home region in the north was the only place the Arabs had never conquered, emphasizing a sense of blood purity that she felt set her apart. Yet, as she spoke, her dark eyes and curly brown hair made her look so much like the local Syrians that she could have easily passed for one of them. This encounter highlights a profound reality in modern Spain, the enduring weight of a medieval past that many want to keep at a distance, even as it is written into their very biology. For centuries, the idea of blood purity was a legal and social obsession in Spain, used to exclude those with Jewish or Muslim ancestors. But modern science has begun to pull back the curtain on this national myth. Genetic studies conducted in the early 21st century have revealed that a significant portion of the Spanish population carries North African and Sephardic Jewish ancestry in their DNA. In a twist that challenges nationalist narratives, some research has even suggested that people in the northwestern regions, like Galicia, may carry more North African genetic markers than those in the south. This suggests that the movement of people across the peninsula was far more fluid than the stories of fixed battle lines would have us believe. These genes are not just relics of an invasion. They are the result of 800 years of people living, marrying, and converting within a shared space. The Moorish blood that some feared would taint their ancestry is, in fact, a fundamental thread in the tapestry of the Spanish people. This inheritance is not just microscopic, it is audible every time a Spaniard speaks. The Spanish language is a Romance language, born from Latin, but it is unique among its cousins for the sheer volume of Arabic influence it carries. There are approximately 4,000 words in the Spanish dictionary that have Arabic roots, accounting for about 8% of the total vocabulary. This is not a collection of obscure technical terms, but a list of everyday words that define the Spanish domestic and social world. A Spaniard rests their head on an almohada, or pillow. They wear clothes made of algodón, or cotton. They season their food with azafrán, or saffron, and eat rice, known as arroz, and olives called aceitunas. Even the game of chess, ajedrez, carries its Arabic name into the modern era. The very landscape of Spain is mapped out in Arabic. The names of cities, rivers, and mountains serve as a linguistic archive of Al-Andalus. Madrid, the capital, derives its name from Mayret, a term related to the abundance of underground water tunnels used for collection. Valladolid is believed to come from Balad al-Walid, named after an Umayyad caliph. The great river of the south, the Guadalquivir, is simply a Spanish rendering of Wadi al-Kabir, meaning the Great River. Sometimes these names reveal a fascinating layering of cultures. The Rio Guadiana, which forms part of the border with Portugal, is a triple redundancy. Rio is Spanish for river, Wadi is Arabic for river, and Ana comes from an ancient Iberian word for water. It is a name that refuses to pick a side, embodying a history that is both and rather than either or. Beyond the words and the genes, the most intimate inheritance of the Muslim past is found in the daily rituals and unwritten rules of Spanish life. In the city of Córdoba, some families still practice a unique tradition to bless their newborns. Behind closed doors, away from the eyes of neighbors, women cradle the infant and delicately clip its first nails while singing soft tunes. These nails are then placed in a small wooden box, which relatives fill with money as a blessing. This ritual bears a striking resemblance to the Islamic practice of akikah, where a baby's hair is cut as a form of blessing. In Córdoba, the practice shifted from hair to nails, a more discreet gesture that could be performed without raising the suspicion of the religious authorities who, for centuries, sought to erase any trace of non-Christian customs. The very layout of the traditional Spanish home, with its shaded central patio and burbling fountain, is a direct descendant of the Andalusian desire to create a paradise on earth. These courtyards were designed to be sanctuaries of cool air and privacy in a harsh climate, a concept imported from the desert cultures of the East. Even the way Spaniards eat was revolutionized during the Islamic period. Before the 9th century, the idea of a structured meal was foreign to much of Europe. It was a polymath and musician named Ziryab, arriving in Córdoba from Baghdad in 822, who changed the course of Western social history. He introduced the 3-course meal, starting with soup, followed by a main dish, and ending with sweets. He brought with him the use of crystal glasses instead of metal goblets, and taught the elite to change their clothing according to the seasons. He even introduced an early form of deodorant based on lead monoxide. Ziryab was a cultural architect who taught Europe how to live with sophistication, and his influence remains visible in every restaurant and household today. The agricultural landscape of Spain was similarly transformed by what historians call the Green Revolution of Al-Andalus. The Muslims brought with them advanced hydraulic engineering skills, reusing and expanding Roman aqueducts and building complex systems of underground channels known as canats. They introduced the noria, or water wheel, and the acequia, or irrigation channel, which turned dry plains into an agricultural cornucopia. This infrastructure allowed for the introduction of crops that are now synonymous with the Spanish identity: lemons, oranges, pomegranates, artichokes, aubergines, and sugarcane. The Tribunal of the Waters in Valencia, a court that still meets every Thursday to settle disputes over irrigation, is a living legal relic of this era, operating on principles established over a millennium ago. Even the most iconic expressions of Spanish culture, like flamenco, are deeply rooted in this cross-cultural exchange. The soulful, guttural tones of the flamenco singer and the rhythmic strumming of the guitar can be traced back to the musical traditions of the Islamic world. The Spanish guitar itself is a descendant of the Aramaic oud, a 4-stringed instrument brought over by the Moors. The very word ojalá, used by Spaniards to mean hopefully or God willing, is a direct phonetic evolution of the Arabic inshallah. While the religious meaning has faded for most, the word remains a daily reminder of a time when the language of the mosque and the language of the street were one and the same. There is a subtle, almost clandestine quality to many of these survivals. In some Andalusian villages, it is still a habit to keep the front door closed during family rituals, a behavior that contrasts with the more open social styles found in North Africa today. This closed-door culture is a psychological scar from the centuries following the fall of Granada, when families had to protect their private traditions from the prying eyes of the Inquisition. A writer once noted how his grandmother would make 2 batches of sweets at Christmas, one for the house made with olive oil, and one to be left outside the door made with pork lard. The grandmother likely didn't know why she did this, but she was perpetuating an unconscious memory from a time when publicly signaling the consumption of pork was a necessary survival strategy for those secretly practicing Islam or Judaism. This invisible inheritance creates a complex psychological state in modern Spain, often described as a split personality. On one hand, the country is intensely proud of its Andalusian heritage. The Alhambra and the Great Mosque of Córdoba are promoted as the crown jewels of the tourism industry, bringing in millions of visitors and billions of euros. The image of the Moorish palace, with its intricate tiles and lush gardens, is used in posters to market the country as a place of exotic beauty and historical depth. Yet, at the same time, there is a deep-seated reluctance to acknowledge the people who built these monuments as part of the national us. This tension is visible in the way history is taught in schools, where 800 years of civilization are often reduced to a few pages. It is also visible in the contemporary reaction to immigration from North Africa. Many Spaniards feel a sense of anti-Arabness that is rooted in a desire to maintain a vision of a white Catholic Spain. They use the term Moro or Moor as a pejorative, often unaware that the very culture they claim to be protecting is built on foundations laid by the people they are excluding. It is a form of desperate self-hatred, where a society rejects the very elements that make it unique. The paradox is that the Moors never truly left. They are flowing in the blood of the people and echoing in the words they speak. The agricultural methods that sustain the Spanish countryside, the architecture that defines its cities, and the music that expresses its deepest emotions are all gifts from a culture that was systematically purged from the official record. When a Spaniard enjoys an olive, walks through a tiled patio, or says "Ojalá," they are participating in a legacy that is more than a millennium old. This invisible inheritance is the proof that history is not just a series of events that happen and then end. It is a living process that shapes our bodies, our thoughts, and our most private habits. As Spain continues to navigate its place in a diverse and globalized world, the recognition of these Arabic traces becomes more than just an academic exercise. It is a necessary step toward a more honest and stable sense of self. By acknowledging that the Islamic past is not an other to be feared, but a fundamental part of the Spanish identity, the country can begin to heal the fragmented sense of history that has haunted it since 1492. The threads of history, identity, and culture are far more intertwined than the nationalist myths would suggest, and the evidence is hidden in plain sight, in every nook and cranny of daily life. This process of cultural blending and the subsequent attempts to deny it created a society of shadows, where the truth of one's origins was often a dangerous secret to be kept from the light. The transition from the fluid, multi-layered world of Al-Andalus to a unified Christian state was not a sudden event that concluded with the fall of Granada in 1492. Instead, it was the beginning of a long, agonizing century of cultural dismantling and psychological trauma. When the last Sultan, Boabdil, surrendered the keys to the Alhambra, the immediate atmosphere was surprisingly one of cautious optimism. The Treaty of Granada, signed by the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, was a document of remarkable tolerance. It promised the Muslim population the right to keep their religion, their language, their traditional dress, and their own legal systems. For a few years, it seemed that a new kind of pluralistic Spain might emerge under Christian sovereignty. The first Archbishop of Granada, Hernando de Talavera, embodied this spirit, choosing to learn Arabic and engaging with the local population through persuasion and respect rather than force. He understood that the people of Granada were not a foreign colony, but a native population deeply rooted in their land. This fragile peace was shattered in 1499 with the arrival of Cardinal Francisco Jiménez de Cisneros. A man of unyielding zeal and authoritarian conviction, Cisneros viewed the slow pace of voluntary conversions as a failure. He discarded the gentle approach of Talavera and launched a campaign of aggressive religious compliance. He began by targeting the Muslim noblemen, believing that if the leaders were broken, the masses would follow. Those who resisted were imprisoned and, according to contemporary reports, subjected to severe treatment and torture. In a symbolic act that would echo through the centuries as a supreme trauma of erasure, Cisneros organized a mass public burning of thousands of Arabic manuscripts in the square of Bib Rambla in Granada. Only medical texts were spared. The rest, centuries of poetry, philosophy, history, and science, were reduced to ash. This was not just a religious act, it was a deliberate attempt to sever a people from their intellectual and cultural past. The predictable result of this state-sponsored violence was the first rebellion of the Alpujarras in 1499. The Muslims of Granada, seeing their treaty rights trampled, rose up in a desperate attempt to defend their way of life. The rebellion was eventually crushed by the massive mobilization of Christian troops, but its most significant consequence was political. Ferdinand and Isabella used the uprising as a legal pretext to revoke the Treaty of Granada entirely. They argued that by rebelling, the Muslims had forfeited their right to protection. In 1502, Queen Isabella issued an edict that presented the Muslims of Castile with a brutal choice: baptism or exile. Because the destinations for exile were restricted to the point of being nearly impossible to reach, and the costs of departure were prohibitive for most families, the vast majority of the population accepted a forced, insincere baptism. The people who emerged from this process were known as Moriscos, a term that literally means little Moors. They were a people caught between two worlds, officially Christian, but viewed with permanent suspicion by the state and the church. The trauma of this forced identity was not limited to Granada. The Kingdom of Navarre saw similar conversions following its annexation in 1515, and the Crown of Aragon followed suit between 1523 and 1526. In Aragon, the situation was particularly complex because the local nobility often protected their Muslim tenants, whose agricultural skills were the backbone of the regional economy. However, after the anti-Muslim violence of the Revolt of the Brotherhoods, King Charles I ruled that conversions performed by mobs were valid, placing tens of thousands of new converts under the jurisdiction of the Spanish Inquisition. By 1526, Islam was no longer officially extant anywhere in Spain. For the Moriscos, life became a permanent performance of survival. To navigate this hostile environment, they turned to a legal and spiritual loophole provided by a North African scholar in 1504, known as the Oran Fatwa. This document allowed Muslims living under persecution to conform outwardly to Christian practices while maintaining their true faith in secret. It detailed how they could perform their ritual prayers through subtle gestures, how they could consume pork or wine if forced, and how they could even perform acts of blasphemy against their own faith if their lives were at stake. This fatwa became the foundation for a clandestine culture of crypto-Islam that would persist for generations. The domestic space became the last sanctuary of Morisco identity, but even here they were not safe. The Spanish Inquisition developed a sophisticated system of surveillance to detect the lingering traces of Islamic practice. Neighbors were encouraged to report any suspicious behavior. A lack of chimney smoke on a Saturday might suggest a family was observing the Sabbath or a hidden holiday. Buying large quantities of vegetables before the spring might indicate the preparation for a secret fast. The simple act of washing one's body too thoroughly or wearing clean clothes on a Friday became a dangerous indicator of heresy. The Inquisition was particularly interested in the domestic privacy of women, suspecting that they were the primary carriers of traditional rituals. The trauma of erasure thus penetrated the most intimate corners of life, turning the home into a place of fear and the act of hygiene into a potential crime. As the 16th century progressed, the state's patience with the Morisco problem began to wear thin. The concept of limpieza de sangre, or blood purity, became a central pillar of Spanish society. It was no longer enough to be a baptized Christian. One had to prove that their lineage was not tainted by Jewish or Muslim blood. This introduced a form of racialized discrimination that marginalized Moriscos regardless of how sincerely they practiced their new faith. They were barred from holding public office, joining prestigious guilds, or entering the priesthood. Even the Jesuits, who initially welcomed converts, adopted a decree in 1593 that barred anyone with any degree of non-Christian ancestry from joining the order. This systemic exclusion reinforced the sense that the Moriscos were a permanent internal enemy, a separate and inferior caste within the body of Spain. The situation reached a breaking point under King Philip II. In 1567, he issued a decree known as the Pragmatica, which stripped away the last vestiges of Morisco cultural expression. The use of the Arabic language, both in speech and writing, was made illegal. Traditional dress was banned, and Morisco women were forbidden from wearing the veil. Public baths, central to the hygiene and social life of Al-Andalus, were ordered to be destroyed. Even the use of traditional names was prohibited. This was a total war on identity, an attempt to complete the erasure that Cisneros had started decades earlier. The result was the Second Rebellion of the Alpujarras, a brutal and bloody conflict that lasted 3 years. The rebellion was characterized by atrocities on both sides, but the state's response was one of calculated demographic destruction. Following the defeat of the rebels in 1571, the entire Morisco population of Granada, some 80,000 people, was forcibly dispersed across the interior of Castile and Andalusia. Families were broken apart and resettled in small groups among old Christian communities, an early form of ethnic cleansing designed to dissolve their cultural cohesion through isolation. Despite these efforts, the Morisco problem persisted in the minds of the Spanish elite. The dispersed communities proved remarkably resilient, maintaining their networks and their secret faith even in the heart of Castile. In the eastern regions, like Valencia, where Moriscos made up 1/3 of the population and lived in concentrated rural areas, they remained almost entirely unassimilated. The rise of the Ottoman Empire as a major naval power in the Mediterranean added a layer of geopolitical paranoia to the internal conflict. The Spanish authorities feared that the Moriscos would act as a fifth column, facilitating a Turkish invasion or aiding the Barbary pirates who regularly raided the Spanish coast. The final act of this tragedy began in 1609, when King Philip III, under the influence of his advisor, the Duke of Lerma, and the fundamentalist Archbishop of Valencia, Juan de Ribera, signed the Edict of Expulsion. Ribera used religious rhetoric to justify the act, citing Old Testament texts that urged the destruction of God's enemies to save the nation from divine wrath. The expulsion was carried out in stages over 5 years, beginning in Valencia and moving through Castile, Aragon, and finally Andalusia. It was an operation of staggering scale and cruelty. An estimated 300,000 people, roughly 4% of the total population of Spain, were ordered to leave their homes with only what they could carry. They were forbidden from taking money, jewels, or any form of portable wealth, which was effectively confiscated by the state. The scenes at the ports of departure, such as Denia and Algeciras, were ones of profound human suffering. Families who had lived on the peninsula for 1,000 years were marched to the coast and loaded onto galleys bound for North Africa. Many were attacked by bandits along the way. Others were robbed or murdered by the very sailors who were supposed to transport them. Upon reaching the shores of the Maghreb, they often faced a second trauma. Although they were being expelled for being secret Muslims, many Moriscos had become culturally Spanish over the generations. They spoke Castilian as their primary language and practiced a hybrid form of faith that was unrecognizable to the more orthodox communities of North Africa. In some places, they were viewed as foreign invaders or suspicious Christians and were met with further hostility and violence. The economic impact of the expulsion was devastating, particularly in Valencia and Aragon, where the loss of skilled agricultural laborers led to the collapse of irrigation systems and the depopulation of entire districts. But the psychological impact on the Spanish identity was even more enduring. The expulsion achieved the goal of a religiously unified state, but it did so by amputating a vital part of the nation's own body. It left behind a society of ghosts, where the silence of the empty villages and the ruins of the mosques served as a permanent reminder of what had been lost. The erasure was never quite as complete as the state intended. In the years following the expulsion, significant numbers of Moriscos managed to return to Spain, often with the protection of their old Christian neighbors or local authorities who valued their presence. They blended into the population, changing their names and burying their pasts even deeper. The last mass prosecution for crypto-Islamic practices occurred in Granada as late as 1727, revealing that even after a century of official absence, the embers of the old identity still flickered in secret. These final convicts received relatively light sentences, a sign that the fiery intensity of the Inquisition was finally beginning to fade. But the practice of Islam had by then been driven so far into the shadows that it had effectively disappeared from the public consciousness. The trauma of this period created a culture of secrecy and a deep-seated anxiety about origins that continues to haunt the Spanish psyche. The closed door of the Andalusian home and the Moorish nickname used for the unbaptized are the lingering echoes of a century when the truth of one's faith or ancestry could be a death sentence. By understanding the systematic nature of this purge, we can see that the otherness of the Muslim past in Spain was not a natural condition, but a manufactured reality, the result of a deliberate and violent process of state building that required the total erasure of the people who had helped build the country. This legacy of forced conversion and expulsion remains the most difficult chapter for modern Spain to reconcile, as it challenges the foundational myth of a pure and unified national destiny. The story of the Moriscos is the story of a people who were told they did not belong in the only home they had ever known, and the scars of that rejection are still visible in the fragmented way the country remembers its own history. This historical memory is now the front line of a new kind of conflict, where the tools of the past are being repurposed for the political battles of the present. Chapter 5. Contested Memory, the Modern Battle for Al-Andalus. The tension surrounding Spain's Islamic past often moves from the quiet halls of libraries to the high-stakes arena of international sports. In December 2022, when Morocco defeated Spain in a World Cup penalty shootout, the streets of Spanish cities became a theater for a very old and very modern conflict. On social media, jokes about Morocco taking back Al-Andalus went viral, while in the physical world, Spanish police were on high alert, fearing riots as extremist groups rallied people to protect the streets from Moroccan supporters. This moment captured a profound discomfort that still sits at the heart of the Spanish psyche. For many, the victory of a North African team wasn't just a sports loss. It was a psychological trigger that resurrected ancient fears of an invasion, proving that the 8 centuries of Muslim rule are not a settled chapter of history, but a living, breathing part of today's political landscape. This modern battle for the past is driven by a deep-seated hypocrisy that critics call a split personality. On one hand, Spain is immensely proud of its Andalusian heritage when it serves the economy. The Alhambra in Granada, the Great Mosque of Córdoba, and the Alcazar of Seville are 3 of the most visited monuments in the country, drawing millions of tourists and generating billions of euros. The government and tourism boards use images of intricate tilework and horseshoe arches to market Spain as a land of exotic, historical depth. Yet, in the classrooms where the next generation of Spaniards is formed, this same history is often treated as an unwanted guest. Many students report that 800 years of civilization are compressed into just 2 pages of a textbook, summarized by a reductive narrative that the Arabs came, they stayed for a while, and then they were fortunately driven out. This creates a society that is happy to profit from the stones of the past while remaining deeply uncomfortable with the culture and faith that created them. The political instrumentalization of this history has become a powerful tool for the rising far right. Parties like Vox have found success by reviving the mythology of the Reconquista to frame modern immigration as a new kind of invasion. They invoke medieval warriors as symbols of a pure, Catholic Spain that must be defended against outside influences. This isn't just rhetoric, it manifests in public spectacles. Not long ago, a former center-right prime minister made headlines for dressing up as El Cid, essentially promoting a vision of a unified and exclusive Christian identity. When political leaders use these symbols, they are not just honoring history, they are taking a sledgehammer to the idea of a pluralistic Spain. They promote a version of the national hero that ignores his reality as a practical mercenary who served both Muslim and Christian masters, choosing instead to present him as a saint of the crusade. This political climate has led to unprecedented legislative moves that challenge the very foundations of the Spanish Constitution. In the town of Jumilla, located in the region of Murcia, a local authority recently passed a ban preventing Muslims from using public facilities like civic centers or gyms to celebrate their major religious festivals, Eid al-Fitr and Eid al-Adha. The proposal stated that municipal facilities could not be used for activities alien to the local identity. This was a first in modern Spain and was met with immediate outrage from civil rights groups who pointed out that the town itself had been a principally Arab settlement for centuries. The ban highlights a growing trend where the term identity is used as a weapon to exclude a community that makes up a significant portion of the population. It reveals a fear that allowing the open practice of Islam in public spaces somehow threatens the Christian character of the land, despite the centuries of Muslim legacy that define the town's own history. The media plays a significant role in shaping these perceptions, often through a lens of Orientalism and fear. Popular television series like El Príncipe, which focuses on drug trafficking and jihadism in the Spanish enclave of Ceuta, have become massive hits, reaching millions of viewers. While entertaining, these shows often recycle vulgar and racist fantasies. Muslim characters are frequently portrayed as cultural monsters, domineering patriarchs, or hyper-nationalists who inevitably turn out to be double agents. The musical score often relies on wailing melodies every time a mosque appears in the background, reinforcing the idea that being Spanish and Muslim is a contradiction. These depictions are not seen by everyone as fiction. For many viewers, they are a primary source of information about Islamic culture, further entrenching the idea that the Muslim neighbor is a mysterious and inscrutable threat. Even the language used in daily life reflects a class-based hierarchy of prejudice. There is a common saying in Spain that if you have enough money, you are an Arab, but if you don't, you are a Moro or Moor. The term Moro has become a pejorative used to label immigrants from North Africa and the Middle East as a lower caste, regardless of their actual background or level of integration. A British citizen of Iranian descent living in a provincial town in Almeria reported being targeted for racist abuse because they met the mental category of the bigot. Their family shop was graffitied with the name of a famous terrorist, and they were subjected to violent threats based on Middle Eastern stereotypes. This racialized fear often translates into systemic barriers that prevent full participation in Spanish society. The prejudice isn't confined to the streets. It reaches into the professional world, where the visible markers of faith can become a liability. A 2025 study highlighted the depth of this ongoing discrimination, revealing that 6 out of 10 Muslim women in Spain have been excluded from job offers, specifically for refusing to remove their hijabs during interviews. This suggests that while the state may officially embrace diversity, the private sector often remains a gatekeeper of a more homogeneous, exclusionary identity, forcing women to choose between their religious convictions and their economic livelihood. This experience shows that the anti-Muslim sentiment in Spain is often less about actual religious practice and more about a racialized fear of the other. Despite these challenges, the Muslim community in Spain is undergoing a vibrant revival that challenges the immigrant religion label. In the last 30 years, the Muslim population has increased tenfold, reaching approximately 2.5 million people. About 1 million of these are Spanish citizens, including a growing number of native converts who are searching for their own roots and identity. In cities like Seville, Córdoba, and Barcelona, there is a noticeable increase in Spaniards embracing Islam, often after exploring the rich history of Al-Andalus. For these individuals, the Great Mosque of Granada, which opened in 2003 as the first new mosque in the city since 1492, represents a meeting point between the past and the present. They see themselves not as newcomers, but as heirs to a tradition that was suppressed for 5 centuries. The presence of high-profile figures like Lamine Yamal, the young football star for the national team and FC Barcelona, has brought these issues into the mainstream. In 2025, during his team's preparations for a major tournament, Yamal decided to fast for Ramadan, marking the first time the Spanish national team had to accommodate a player's religious diet. He represents a new generation of Spanish Muslims who practice their customs as an integral part of a diverse society. His success on the field provides a counter-narrative to the negative stereotypes, showing that one can be both a proud Spaniard and a devout Muslim. However, this visibility also makes him a target for the same far-right rhetoric that views any public expression of Islam as an affront to Spanish identity. The legal framework for religious diversity in Spain is also a site of ongoing struggle. In 1992, the state signed a cooperation agreement with the Islamic Commission, promising rights such as Islamic religious education in schools and space in cemeteries for traditional burials. Decades later, many of these promises remain unfulfilled. Only about 1 in 10 Muslim children has access to religious classes at their school, and a tiny fraction of municipalities provide space for Islamic burials. Many administrations still operate under the assumption that Muslims will be buried in their countries of origin, ignoring the fact that many are Spanish-born or in exile with no other home. It took the tragedy of the global pandemic for some city councils to finally acknowledge the need for local burial plots, as the closing of borders made the repatriation of bodies impossible. The debate over the use of the Great Mosque of Córdoba is perhaps the most iconic example of this modern battle. While it currently serves as a Catholic cathedral, a significant percentage of Spaniards, around 40%, are in favor of allowing Muslims to pray there once again, recognizing its dual heritage. This sentiment reflects a growing secularism in Spanish society that judges all religions by the same egalitarian standards. Many people who are critical of certain Islamic practices, such as the use of the veil or gender segregation, are equally critical of the Catholic Church's stance on female priests or celibacy. For this segment of the population, the rejection of religious influence in public life is not about Islamophobia, but about a commitment to a modern, secular state where the rights of the individual take precedence over any theological doctrine. However, the rise of online hate speech and hate crimes suggests that the more extreme, exclusionary views are gaining ground. Monitoring tools have shown a sharp increase in Islamophobic content on social media, often linking the presence of Muslims to unfounded claims of terrorism financing or the replacement of local workers. These digital attacks sometimes translate into real-world violence, such as the attack on a mosque in Madrid following a major European terrorist incident. The perpetrators often cite fake news spread by far-right propagandists as their motivation. While the government has launched protocols to combat illegal hate speech online, the impunity for these crimes remains widespread, with only a small fraction of incidents resulting in a police report. The modern view of Muslim history in Spain is thus caught between two competing forces. One seeks to reclaim the Andalusian past as a shared inheritance of progress, tolerance, and creativity, a crucial link that brought knowledge to Europe and shaped the modern West. The other seeks to erase or externalize that past, treating it as a foreign interruption that must be kept behind the walls of a museum. This conflict is visible in the very streets of the capital. While many people forget or choose not to know its origins, Madrid remains the only European capital founded by Muslims. This historical fact stands as a silent challenge to the nationalist myths, a reminder that the Islamic past is not just a shadow on the horizon, but the very ground on which the modern nation is built. The history of Muslim Spain is not a closed chapter, but a living dialogue between myth and reality. We have seen how the nationalist narrative of the Reconquista attempted to erase 8 centuries of profound cultural exchange. Yet the legacy of Al-Andalus remains an indelible part of the national DNA, found in the language, the landscape, and the very blood of the people. Today, Spain remains caught between profiting from its Islamic monuments and reconciling with its modern Muslim identity. This struggle reveals that the other, so often feared in political rhetoric, is, in fact, a foundational part of the Spanish self. To acknowledge this history is not to lose a national identity, but to finally claim a whole one. Thank you for listening to this exploration of Spain's complex and enduring heart.